A few weeks ago, in conversation with Stripe co-founder John Collison, he mentioned that the starting salary for some software engineering graduates is €100,000. He said, and I quote, "I don't think this has leaked out into the popular consciousness here in Ireland." So is Ireland in an unrestricted boom? Will conservative middle-class parents soon be saying, "Help, help, my daughter, the software engineer, is drowning"? And what effect might this be having on the rest of society, on rents, on house prices? And is there a danger, finally, of Dublin following cities like San Francisco and becoming more homogenized and maybe even a bit more boring? Well, to discuss some of the aspects of this, I'm joined today by Stephen Kinsella, a newly tenured professor of economics and director of immersive software engineering at University of Limerick. Stephen, first of all, congratulations on your elevation.
Much.
Now, 100 grand to people who are following the industry. This will be no surprise to those who are applying for some of these hotly contested jobs. I think it would be to a lot of lay people.
I'm an economist. I studied the Irish economy. It was a surprise to me. This is when John was talking about it being a kept secret. There's a very good reason why it's a kept secret, because if you're an employer, and John is, you don't particularly want your employees to know that the reservation wage is in the top 2% of all income earners in the entire economy, and that's for somebody who's 22 or 23 years old. Right now, I think I looked at John said that, and I'm an economist. I went looking at the numbers. He's not just right. It is ridiculous, the kinds of salaries that software engineers, in particular software engineers working in multinational companies, actually get. And so it is not uncommon for somebody who's 30 years old to be on 120 to 140,000 euros a year. And just to make it clear, that's for a job which is like, you work hard, but it's, you are not a brain surgeon. You're not pulling people out of wrecked cars. It's a really nice, extremely well-paid job with excellent terms and conditions that you can do anywhere. Like you mentioned, help my daughter, the software engineer is drowning. Like, I'm completely stealing that, but that's an excellent line. I think when people are going in through the CEO process, which actually closed yesterday, the first round of the CEO closed yesterday. And when people go through the process, they think, they immediately go, well, I would love my daughter to do theoretical physics in Trinity or medicine or law or something like that. Software engineering tends not to be in those cohorts. But if you ran it as a horse race between, brilliant student A and her clone, right, and ran it as a horse race just together in terms of median income, so not the average, but the median income, and just ran it. If person A decided to do software engineering at UL, right, and they, they'll do it in 4 years, they'll get a master's degree, they'll get 50% of the time in companies and so forth, and there's the sales pitch. And then the same brilliant student decided to do medicine. At the end of year 4, okay, the software engineer has started work in a company like Stripe or I'm just thinking one
Intercom or any of the
60 companies we have. Actually, just my brain just at a blockage there. Intercom.
It's a good program, yeah.
Or Amazon or somewhere like that. And they started working in one of those companies. They would start on 100,000. And that's, by the way, the starting salary. Our other person still has 2 more years of medical school to go, after which time she becomes an intern on like 40 grand a year, working 100 hours a week. And then she has a bunch of other qualification steps to go before she becomes a consultant, probably in her mid-30s, right? Meantime, the other clone version of her has been earning a fortune in a highly, highly scarce environment for a very, very long time. So you're talking about and so when I think about it, I think about like euros per CAO point, right? The marginal benefit, the benefit that you would get for your CAO points, if I could direct my son or my daughters my sons or daughters to a program, it would not be medicine, it would not be law, it would not be architecture, it would not be accountancy, it wouldn't even be economics. In terms of euros per CAO point, the highest return by far, the data, I have the data, and they are ridiculous. Like, I checked them 4 times. Like, it's so good as to be almost amazing that people haven't heard about it. You would direct them into a software engineering course for sure.
I'm conscious that money is not the be all and end all. I'm conscious that I also introduced at the beginning of this podcast the idea of money and a return. But I remember being fascinated when I looked at the CSO figures a couple of years ago. And at that point, IT careers were just starting to overtake or draw up to financial industry, for example, salaries. And money is not the be all and end all. But if you're talking about conservative middle class parents and you're talking about that rump of middle class society, it's about a little bit more than that as well. It's about predictability, stability, 10, 20 years. And I'm just wondering, is there going to come a point, arguably we're already seeing it now, where, young Sean or young Moira in their mid-20s or their late 20s, and they chose their medicine or they chose the law, which the law is a particularly bad one actually until you get a bit older. And they're now being outbid on the 2-bed apartment or the 3-bed semi in the area their parents live, in the area they grew up. They're being outbid by the software engineering graduate. And it's at that point, I think, I'm wondering whether it becomes real to that class of middle class parents that actually, no, you've been thinking about tech all wrong. You've been thinking about it as these scruffy bearded types in basements, like twiddling with wires. Actually, you should be thinking about this as a tier 1 professional class.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we've been very clear about as we've marketed the ISE course is to show what a day in the life of a software engineer actually is, because when you look at it, yes, you earn a very high salary, like that's really clear, but and you will earn it far faster than others. But what is also true is the job is really interesting. So we would have, companies like Rent the Runway, companies like Watershed, companies like Provisio. Like, these are not companies where you sit in an office down in the basement twiddling with code. And Provisio, for example, it's an Irish-based company. They do accident prevention detection technology. So, we have this cool video where the guys are driving around in a Range Rover, picking up data for potential crash and impacts, and then modeling it afterwards. So it's pretty cool kind of tech that people are doing. Or you look at analog devices, every sensor that's in every object on your iPhone, on anything else, these guys build it. It's amazing. So, I'm persuaded of the fact that there's a level of coolness to these jobs. And again, as you said, and thank you very much for the kind words. Like, I'm a professor at a university, and we're not badly paid people. And I've looked at these software engineers' salaries, and I thought, I have made the wrong choices with my life.
Yeah.
So Johnny and Jane may, as they are outbid for these software engineers working for multinational companies, and now, by the way, by national companies. I think there in maybe 5 years ago, Adrian, there was an idea that this is basically just Google and Amazon and so forth, these big multinational companies and all that. Now, as your own excellent reporting shows, we've got lots and lots of our own domestic companies. In fact, I believe there's even one this week, which is amazing. So
that's right, yeah.
Is it 6 unicorns?
We've 6 now. We've 2 just in this month alone. So there's the kind of and the one this week, Wayflyer. It only took 3 years for that to get to a post 1 billion.
I'm just so excited for those guys. I just think that's brilliant.
Now, hang on. Now, let me just broaden this out a little bit. So there's 2 things I wanted to ask about. One is serious. One is not quite as serious, but it's also relevant. The serious one is on what the maybe external effects of all this are having. The accommodation, rental, housing crisis is a thing we've all been looking at. I think one of the most talked about issues in that is the rise in income for a certain section of society looking for those apartments. If you take Dublin 2 and Dublin 4, for example, you go for a 2-bed apartment there, you're now paying, it's normal now to be asked for €3,500 for a 2-bed apartment, certainly over $3,000 in some of those areas. That's approaching Seattle and San Francisco levels. But why is the rent at that level? Yes, there's a shortage of supply in general. There are macro issues like that, but I don't think we're exploring enough the idea that in the last 10 years in particular, there is a sizable cohort of the working population, mostly brought about by the tech companies there, that are now earning 6 figures, and for whom $3,000 a month is not an unreasonable rent. But if that is the case, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, like, what do we do then, or how do we think about those of us, like mere journalists or mere academics or whatever it is, or someone working in the spa or the supermarket? How do we think about people who are earning far less, and how does this all stitch together?
Well, it's a great point. I guess the first thing is there's clearly a very, very strong demand for these kinds of skills, right? And so it strikes me that the kinds of people who can take ideas and make them real, and that's what software engineers are, they're never going to be in the kind of demand that they're in now, unless we're creating new companies that these people can go work in, or that they themselves can start. Mm-hmm. So to the extent that there is some kind of, I hate the phrase, but startup ecosystem.
Why do you hate that phrase? That's fine.
Yeah, it's because so excessively Americanized. Like the word spiritual. It's kind of like, what does it mean? It's the same thing. But yeah, the idea that there's a bunch of people roughly in the same place, they do roughly the same thing, and you can move between them if you want to. Like that's really powerful. Now, your question is, so I think we should be making more of these people, and that's why the ISE degree exists, right? And I hope there are more like them, and I hope more people go to computer science courses, because it's genuinely the way forward. The question is, what are the societal effects? Well, the societal effects of a bunch of younger people on loads and loads of money, and the spatial effects have actually been really well studied. They've been studied in Berlin in the 1980s, in London in the 80s and 90s, and I think we're going to end up studying them in this decade too. Basically, you've got a bunch of people who can afford anything, and what do? They bid up the price of everything, right? And that's simply the case. Now, the market should respond by creating more of the thing that is demanded. The problem is, this is housing in Ireland, and which is the main store of people's wealth. So everyone has a very, very strong incentive to stop the creation of more of the supply, which is the problem that we have in San Francisco. The problem we have in San Francisco is not the billionaires and millionaires and rich people wandering around buying lattes. The problem is people who own accommodation don't want to see their asset values go down. That's exactly the situation you have in Dublin. And so, it's where tech policy and FDI connects with spatial policy and housing policy is a really interesting, fertile area, because it's not, you can always make an argument if you're of the right-wing persuasion, which I'm not, but if you're of the right-wing persuasion, you can say, well, the state shouldn't be paying for people's houses. They should find a way to do that themselves. Yes, nobody should be homeless, but we shouldn't be building mansions in the middle of Dublin for the poor. The left-hand version of that, or the left side of that, it should say, listen, the state can provide these services much more cheaply if you build it as infrastructure, and therefore that price of housing should go down, which should make it easier for multinational firms to attract talent. Of course, we know that's not actually an issue, because the multinational firm just simply increases its wage to cope with everything else. So unless you have a very large expansion of supply of housing, and you can get into a row on the internet about what kind of supply it is. I'm of the opinion, personally, it doesn't necessarily matter what kind of supply it is. People will jump into the build to rent or whatever. There's different ideological takes on it by lots of activists, some of whom pose on the internet as academics. But the big point about it is, if there are more places for people to live, and then the price of things will go down. That violates the fundamental policy prescription of all Irish policy, going back to the foundation of the state, which is the price of housing shall rise. That's the fundamental thing.
We do have a hang up over that.
No, it's not. It's not a hang-up. It's a unofficial official policy, and you will not hear it. I've interviewed Ona Bryn, who's excellent housing spokesperson for Sinn Féin, really erudite guy, one of the most knowledgeable people about housing policy in this country, and who I think would make an excellent housing minister. And you know, he's not just a man of the left; like he's literally an old school Gramscian, right? And he's saying, yeah, I don't know about this reducing the house price thing. He just wants it to moderate, you know, and it's interesting that
it's a very difficult one to square that one.
There's no if you come out as a political party tomorrow. I'm not a political scientist, not my area of expertise. But if you rock out as a political party tomorrow, and you say my plan is I'm going to reduce the price of housing for everybody. Your parents won't vote for you.
No, you'd be
your best friend.
You'd be thrown out in a heartbeat. Yeah.
And
now we're in the bind where your ordinary Dublin 3-bed semi might cost $450. It might cost $650 depending on where you live. And you know, are we trapped, you know, into that price scheme?
The minute you buy it, you become part of the asset owning class.
I know, right? That's right. And that is and so that sort of generates generational stuff as well.
There's
between
a huge problem with this
tension between, you know, people in their 20s and 30s, all of that. Let me ask, you mentioned San Francisco, I mentioned San Francisco. Here's another completely left field take on the whole thing. You mentioned the word cool and making these products and services. I would agree with you. One thing I have found walking around San Francisco, only in the last 5 or 6 years, not so much 15 years ago, the place is kind of boring, right? Now, here, I'm going to put this to you. San Francisco has a tech takeover, has had for 30, 40 years, but certainly in the last 15 years, an online tech takeover, the Googles, the Salesforces. And now when I walk around San Francisco, nobody's around after 10 p.m. at night, unless they're, you know, one of the unfortunates who is homeless. And that's a completely different topic. We've done a separate podcast on that. The place is boring. It's the same type of cafes, the same type of people walking around. There's a Tesla dealership on a, you know, the residential corner store. But I do wonder, as interesting and as worthy and as cool as some of these companies and these courses are, and I'm not suggesting that we're at a tipping point, but if the current trajectory of tech jobs in Dublin were to continue, the ever bigger part of the pie, I do wonder whether we'd become a slightly more boring, slightly more homogenized city.
Yeah, I mean, I take your point. I mean, for me, San Francisco is a bit like the Japanese economy. You kind of study it to see where things are going to be in 20 or 30 years when we age up as a society. And in fact, Japan has housing policy pretty much down. They have pension policy pretty much down. We have neither. And, you know, everyone talks about housing, but housing is just another asset. Most people who are under 40 don't have access to either a pension or a house, and that's a massive policy problem, which we can't get into here. But there is a point I wanted to make earlier about, you know, what do you do with all these young people wandering around on $100,000 a year? And the answer is you tax the arses off them. Right. I mean, but if I think Ireland is trending anyway to become a more social democratic society, which means you tax people more at higher incomes, sure, but you also tax people at lower incomes more too, because you demand higher levels of service and health and education and so forth. I feel there's going to be no issue with taxing, you know, 27-year-old a little bit more. That might help moderate prices a little bit.
Yeah.
But you got to remember that those jobs are globally competitive, right? So in the same way that we train way more doctors, like I think we train 14 doctors per 100,000 of the population, and I think we only use 2.3. I believe that's the latest, and we export way more of those doctors. Anyways, the reason is that working in the health system is really tough and kind of crap. Similarly, if you make it sort of it's difficult for these people to live well, they'll leave. So redistribute their income, tax them. They won't notice much of it anyway. Another 300, 400 quid to somebody who's on 5 or 6 grand a month. They're not going to notice that particularly.
Well, and particularly if they're younger people, they don't have as much. They may not have a family. They're not thinking as much. But again, just
into the arts though.
Right. To come back to my rather shallower question that I was at, you know, are we just going to be more boring? Like, are we tech types? Are we going to ruin Dublin? At least the doctors and some of the others, they're a bit of crack. I mean, I'm not saying we're not crack, but like we do sort of, I'm not sure, do we support kind of music venues and like different sort of things the way that other cross sector? I'm using my experience of San Francisco here. I swear to God, I was walking around San Francisco the last few times I've done it. It's boring, and I'm seeing the same people in their uniform, in their polo shirts, or their, whatever it is, on their scooters. I'm going, oh God.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know. What I can tell you is that, we're recording this on the sort of week when the Science Gallery and Chapters Bookstore are closing, right? So we are losing our cultural archetypes already. We're talking about knocking down pubs to build apartment blocks. So,
right.
The character of Dublin is changing. And look, I'm from Dublin. I grew up in the city centre.
Yeah.
I will brook absolutely no nonsense about some halcyon past where everything was grand.
No, and we had terrible ruins on the quays and everything. I agree with all of that. I'm just wondering, does everybody suddenly drive a Tesla Model 3? Does everybody suddenly wear the same kind of, jeans and t-shirt? I'm exaggerating here, but it's one of the areas about the influence of the tech industry and those who work in it, as well remunerated and as productive and valuable to society in many ways as they are they just dull?
I think so. I mean, I can tell you that as part of the immersive software engineering thing, we've spoken to about 200 companies, and most of those people, I would not describe them as dull. Now, to be fair, I've met most of them on Zoom calls, so it's not like we were having a pint when we met. But I can also say that I'd love to have a pint with most of them.
You see, are you and I qualified to say, like, are you dull? Am I dull? Like, I'm a tech reporter, right?
Dude, I'm an economist. I'm an economist. I mean,
this is my point. This is my point. Are we Are we sort of like, because as much as I'm questioning the system here and questioning the emergence of this new tech ruling class of sorts, for want of a better term, I often talk about it in a progressive way. This is actually really interesting. Ireland is taking its place at the first tier industrial table. It's really important. It's probably the first time we've done it in an aggregated way. We've always had big companies, Guinness, and we've had a few big players, but we arguably haven't participated at the top table in an industry the way that we are now just starting to do tech. So overall, it's a good thing. But does it mean that we all sort of, not all, but we become a little bit more anesthetized? I don't know. I'm not explaining this well.
I know where you're coming from, though, and I think most of your listeners will get the general gist, which is, if everyone is, for want of a better word, upper middle class in a certain area, does that make that area boring? I mean, I think the answer is probably no, as long as you, again, it comes back to the planning and spatial stuff, right? If you've got a good mix of people around the place, you've got older households, younger households, poorer households, which are households are kind of in the same rough area, then that's fine. If you create, I mean, we talk about ghettos and slums and this kind of stuff. Like, there are such things as middle class ghettos, and you see them in America all the time. I used to live there, and they have these kind of gated communities, and they're very like rigidly enforced. This kind of
they're very unappealing when you're walking by them, I have to say.
I know, and this huge gate and whatever. So I mean, I think we can avoid a lot of that with decent planning. Although I have to tell you, everything I've seen about planning in this country for the last, I mean, I'm back here 16 years, and as long as I've been back here, we've had this battle between cars and not cars, and cars have won. I think if the tech people are like, wouldn't it be great if we had a few greenways on which to drive our scooters wearing our polo necks? Would that be a bad thing? Probably not. I totally agree with you on the fundamental thing about tech companies is that you don't need an industrial base to run them. All Stripe is a bunch of lads, some servers, a few polo necks, and some code.
And the mob, according to
the mafia.
According to last week's Twitter rant, for listeners who haven't heard that.
It was a dark week for many people. Last week was the end of January. They're still waiting to get paid. People were on Twitter were uniquely and completely pissed off. And then this mafia thing came along, and I think the quality of the shit posting was off the charts, and I commend everyone for their participation in that unique societal event.
For those who don't know what we're talking about, it was a thread that an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley put up. You go look it up on Twitter. It's which compared Stripe to the mob. And it was kind of a fun thread. It was treated as such. Stephen, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. I don't think we have much time left, but I just want to thank you, Professor of Economics and Director of the Immersive Software Engineering Program at the University of Limerick. And I was down there last month at the university, and there seemed to be a huge amount of excitement around that. So congratulations on all of that. And from me, Adrian Wecker, the tech editor of the Irish and Sunday Independent, that's all we have time for this week. So I'll talk to you the same time next week. Bye-bye.